When Robert Redford's family opened the files he left behind, they expected to find a will, maybe a list of properties, art pieces, or business holdings. But what they discovered instead made them cry. Not because of greed or shock, but because they suddenly realized how little they had truly known about the man they loved. There, hidden between trust papers and handwritten letters, was a secret that changed how they saw him forever. Robert Redford's greatest fortune wasn't measured in money or gold or fame. It was something far quieter, far deeper, the kind of wealth that doesn't sit in a bank account. For decades, Redford was one of Hollywood's most magnetic figures, an actor with the golden hair, the calm voice, and that impossible mix of confidence and melancholy. He was the man who could walk into a room and make silence feel cinematic. But what the world saw was only the surface. Behind every scene, behind every award, he was quietly building something that would outlive him, a legacy his children wouldn't fully understand until the very end. This is not a story about scandal. It's a story about meaning, about a man who turned pain into purpose and success into something larger than himself. Because while other stars built empires for display, Robert Redford built one in silence, piece by piece, acre by acre, thought by thought, away from flashing lights and red carpets. And when the truth surfaced, even those closest to him were left in tears. What exactly did they find? Was it a secret fortune, a private empire no one knew existed? Or was it something entirely different? A message he had spent his whole life trying to leave behind. To understand it, we have to go back, long before the Sundance Kid, before the fame, before the cameras, back to a restless young man who didn't quite belong anywhere, a boy who failed out of college, drifted through Europe, and returned to America with one clear belief, that real wealth would never be found in applause or money, but in freedom. The journey of Robert Redford is not about what he owned, but what he built and what he left behind when no one was watching. Because sometimes the richest lives are the ones lived in silence.
Robert Redford was born in Santa Monica, California, but his roots reached back to the quiet land of Utah, where his family's Mormon heritage traced generations of discipline and silence. He grew up between two worlds, the restless energy of post-war California and the moral restraint of the Mountain West. From a young age, he knew he didn't fit either. He wasn't rebellious for the sake of it. He simply couldn't stand a life already mapped out for him. As a teenager, he felt trapped inside a system that demanded obedience, grades, and good manners. He wanted freedom. He wanted art. But in a time and place where dreams like that were considered useless, he found himself lost. He began to drink, skip classes, and by his own admission, he wasted his chance. The University of Colorado eventually expelled him, and just like that, his life plan vanished. Most men would have gone home defeated. Redford went to Europe. With the little money he had saved, he wandered through France, Spain, and Italy, sketching street corners, painting strangers, and learning to survive on curiosity. Those years changed him more than any acting school ever could. He slept in train stations, painted houses for food, and watched a kind of human honesty that didn't exist in the America he had left behind. That was when he discovered the truth he would live by forever, that freedom was the only real wealth worth having. Not freedom from poverty, but freedom from other people's expectations. When he came back to the United States, he was different. He carried himself with a quiet confidence that didn't need approval. He studied art in Brooklyn, drifted into theater in Los Angeles, and eventually found himself standing under the Broadway lights in Barefoot in the Park. It wasn't the fame that thrilled him, it was the discipline, the craft, the stillness between the lines. People began to notice something unusual about him. He wasn't chasing the Hollywood dream, he was testing it. Even then, when the money started coming in, Redford avoided the temptations that swallowed so many young stars. He bought no mansion in Beverly Hills, no glittering cars. Instead, he began buying pieces of land, remote, quiet, untouched, in the mountains of Utah. He once told a friend, "I don't want to own things, I want to protect them." Those early purchases would later become the foundation of a secret empire no one expected. But for now, he was simply a young actor with a rebel's spirit and an artist's soul, standing at the edge of Hollywood, still unsure whether to step in or walk away. Because even then, Robert Redford wasn't chasing fame. He was chasing space, the space to build a life on his own terms.
Success came almost by accident. When Redford stepped into Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid in 1969, he wasn't supposed to be the star. Paul Newman already had the charm, the fame, the effortless glow. But when the cameras rolled, it was Redford's quiet defiance, that stillness, that hint of loneliness in his smile that made the film timeless. Audiences didn't just see a handsome outlaw. They saw something deeper, something they couldn't name. Within a few short years, Hollywood crowned him its golden man. The Sting, The Way We Were, All the President's Men, every film seemed to turn into legend. Yet, the more the spotlight followed him, the more he began to retreat. He once admitted that fame felt like being trapped behind glass. Everyone can see you, but no one can hear you breathe. While other actors bought yachts and villas, Redford bought silence. He used his new fortune to acquire land in Utah, not for profit, but for peace. He didn't decorate it with marble or fountains, he left it wild. Friends said he would disappear there for weeks, hiking alone, sketching the mountains, returning to Hollywood only when he needed to. Behind the camera, Redford was equally demanding. He fought for realism in his roles, sometimes clashing with producers. During All the President's Men, he personally financed reshoots after the studio refused to pay. For him, truth mattered more than money. It was never about being the biggest star. It was about being the one who still believed in integrity. Few knew that throughout the 1980s, he quietly began funding small, independent film projects under anonymous names. He supported struggling filmmakers who couldn't get through Hollywood's gates. Some of them would later credit him for saving their careers, though he never asked for acknowledgement. The irony was striking. The man who avoided fame was now shaping the very future of cinema. Yet the more he gave away, the more people wondered why. Was it guilt? A search for redemption? Or was it his way of redefining what wealth meant? In truth, Redford was building something only he could see. An empire that wasn't made of money or power, but of ideas. A quiet revolution that would one day carry his name, but never his ego. Because even at the height of his fame, when the world called him a Hollywood god, Robert Redford was already planning his escape into a life where art, not applause, would be his legacy.
For all his discipline and calm, Robert Redford carried a private sorrow that shaped everything he became. In the summer of 1959, years before the fame, he and his first wife, Lola Van Wagenen, welcomed their first child, a baby boy named Scott. Redford was only 22, still uncertain about who he was, still trying to make a living. Just 10 weeks later, Scott died suddenly of sudden infant death syndrome. It was a pain so deep, Redford never found the words for it. He almost never spoke of it again, but his silence said everything. That loss carved a permanent wound. It changed the way he saw love, family, and success. It made him distant at times, reflective at others. Even when he smiled on screen, there was something haunting behind his eyes, a weight that audiences felt but couldn't explain. For Redford, acting became a form of therapy, a way to express what he could never say out loud. Years later, when he directed Ordinary People, the story of a father unable to connect with his grief-stricken son, critics called it a masterpiece. But to Redford, it was something else. It was confession. It was him finally speaking through art. The film went on to win 4 Oscars, including Best Director, his first. When asked about its emotional core, he only said, "You can't escape loss. You can only learn to live honestly beside it." But fame didn't heal him. It only made him more protective. He raised his other children, Shauna, Jamie, and Amy, with quiet intensity, shielding them from Hollywood's chaos. He didn't want them to grow up in the shadow of his name or in the spotlight that had burned so many others. For Redford, love meant distance. Care meant control. Lola, his wife, eventually grew weary of the silence. After 27 years of marriage, they divorced. She once said, "He loved deeply but privately, sometimes too privately." It wasn't bitterness, it was truth. Behind the public image of the gentle icon was a man still learning how to grieve, still trying to balance art and fatherhood, guilt and legacy. And as the years passed, Redford began to pour his energy into something he could shape, something that would last beyond his failures as a husband or a father. He began building a world where creation could heal, a place where silence became art and art became redemption.
In the late 1960s, while Hollywood saw Robert Redford as its newest golden hero, he was quietly driving through the mountains of Utah, looking for solitude. Far from the flashing cameras and billboards bearing his name, he discovered a stretch of wilderness that felt untouched by time. Snow-dusted pines, creeks that whispered through canyons, and a silence that reminded him of who he used to be. He bought it. All of it. Nearly 6,000 acres of raw land that he would protect, not exploit. He named it after his most famous role, Sundance. But the name wasn't about fame, it was about spirit. Redford once said, "Sundance wasn't a character I played, it was a way of life." At first, no one understood what he was doing. Friends thought it was just a mountain retreat, but Redford was building something far larger, a sanctuary for independent voices, for the kind of films Hollywood didn't care about. He began hosting small gatherings for unknown directors, writers, and students. They slept in cabins, shared meals, and watched each other's work on makeshift projectors. It was simple, human, real. Exactly what he had been missing in an industry obsessed with glamour. By the early 1980s, that small experiment became the Sundance Institute, and later, the Sundance Film Festival. It started as an idea, a place to help storytellers who had nowhere else to go, and grew into one of the most important cultural movements in modern cinema. Filmmakers like Quentin Tarantino, Steven Soderbergh, and Darren Aronofsky would later credit Sundance for launching their careers. But Redford never made it about himself. He stayed behind the scenes, guiding, financing, encouraging. Always the mentor, never the showman. What few people knew was how much of his own fortune he poured into it. While studios made headlines for blockbuster budgets, Redford quietly funded scholarships, built screening rooms, even paid travel costs for students who couldn't afford to come. His accountants warned him that the investments would never pay back. He didn't care. "You don't plant trees to get rich," he said once. "You plant them so someone else can sit under them." He refused to commercialize the land.
no chain hotels, no massive developments. Even when investors offered millions, Redford turned them down. He preferred the silence of the valley, the laughter of young artists, and the whisper of wind through the aspens. To him, Sundance was wealth, not in dollars, but in purpose. When his family finally uncovered how much he had quietly given away, they were stunned. He had structured his finances so that entire parts of his property, film profits, and art sales flowed directly into the nonprofit that kept Sundance alive. Some of it under shell companies no one had ever heard of. Others under anonymous donations that carried no name at all. By the time the truth surfaced, Sundance had grown into a self-sustaining world, a living ecosystem of creativity, education, and preservation. Its estimated value was in the hundreds of millions, but almost none of it technically belonged to Redford. He had already given it away. The man who had once said he didn't want to own things had kept his word. What his family found wasn't a hidden bank account or secret vault. It was a living legacy, buried under the trees he planted half a century earlier. That was the wealth that made them cry. When Robert Redford's children finally began sorting through his estate, what they uncovered was unlike anything they had expected. There were no flashy investments, no long lists of luxury holdings or private jets. What they found instead were hundreds of documents, quiet, carefully organized, each pointing to charities, environmental trusts, and creative endowments he had quietly built over decades. Many were filed under obscure names: Mountain Way LLC, Wild Earth Foundation, Desert Bloom Trust. Each one held land, royalties, and shares that together formed an invisible empire, not for profit, but for preservation. Redford had used his wealth as a shield. He redirected nearly every major paycheck, from The Sting to All Is Lost, into funds that supported independent filmmakers, conservation programs, and Native American art initiatives. When most of his generation of actors retired to comfort, Redford doubled down on purpose. He once told his son, "Money should flow, not pile up. When it piles up, it starts to rot." The family learned that much of the land surrounding Sundance was already under environmental protection deeds, ensuring it could never be sold or developed. He had locked it away, not for his heirs, but for the earth itself. To outsiders, it might have looked like an eccentric decision. To those who knew his heart, it made perfect sense. He was never building for himself. He was preserving a space for others to breathe. Shauna Redford later admitted that the discovery broke her heart in the most beautiful way. She said in an interview years later, "We thought he was hiding money. He was hiding generosity." They realized that their father hadn't left them with endless comfort. He had left them with responsibility to protect what he built, to continue what he began. His hidden wealth extended beyond Sundance. There were anonymous donations to cancer research, scholarships for low-income students, and a fund supporting rural theaters across America. He'd arranged all of it quietly, refusing public acknowledgement. When the press tried to trace the sources of several large environmental gifts, the trail led back to nameless foundations that, one by one, pointed toward his signature in the fine print. The scale of his giving stunned even the accountants who handled his estate. By the time every document was tallied, it became clear that Robert Redford's true net worth, if measured not in what he kept, but in what he gave, was far beyond any list Forbes had ever printed. He had rewritten the meaning of legacy. For his family, it was both humbling and heartbreaking. They had spent years believing he was distant, preoccupied,
hard to reach. But in those papers, in those hidden trusts and anonymous endowments, they found proof of what he had been trying to say all along, that love doesn't need to be loud to be real. Robert Redford had turned Hollywood wealth into forests, rivers, classrooms, and films that would outlive him. His fortune wasn't buried underground. It was growing everywhere. In the final years of his life, Robert Redford withdrew even further from the noise of Hollywood. He rarely attended award shows, gave fewer interviews, and spent most of his time walking the trails of Sundance at dawn. He'd built a small cabin at the edge of a clearing where the first sunlight hit the pines. Visitors said he would sit on the porch in silence, coffee in hand, watching the light move across the valley. That was how he measured time, not in trophies or contracts, but in sunrises. He once said to a close friend, "I've been rich, I've been broke, and neither changes who you are when you're alone." That sentence carried the weight of a lifetime. For him, wealth was never the sum of what you owned. It was the peace of knowing you lived by your principles. And by that measure, Redford may have been one of the richest men alive. He left no monuments, no skyscrapers with his name, no sprawling estate turned museum. What he left behind were living things, forests that still breathe, rivers that still run clean, and artists who still find their voice because he believed they should. His life was proof that influence doesn't need to shout. It can whisper quietly through generations. After his passing, tributes poured in from across the world, not from movie executives or politicians, but from filmmakers, students, and conservationists whose paths had been shaped by his generosity. One young director wrote, "He never met me, but because of him, I made my first film." And that changed everything. For his family, the greatest moment came not during memorials or press tributes, but one afternoon at Sundance, when they walked the trails he had built decades earlier. The air was still, the trees golden in the light. They realized then what his hidden fortune truly was. Not the land, not the trust funds, not the assets, but the spirit of continuity. The idea that art and nature are two sides of the same truth. Both require patience, both demand respect, both belong to everyone. Redford's voice still echoes through the valley, not in words, but in presence, in the rustle of leaves, the laughter of young filmmakers, the rhythm of a world he helped preserve. Before he died, he wrote one final note tucked inside a folder marked Legacy. It read simply, "Wealth is what you give away before you die. Everything else is just possession." And so, between the silence of the mountains and the memories of a golden era, Robert Redford's true fortune remains, not hidden, but alive, waiting quietly for the next generation to find it.